Welcome to the Vegan Pulse. I am your host, Nancy Arenas. Today, my guest is Harold Brown. Harold is a former beef and dairy farmer and spent over half his life in agriculture. After a health crisis forced him to confront the incidence of heart disease in his family, he went vegan. Living on a vegan diet led him to re-examine all of his previous assumptions about eating animals. He experienced a profound conviction that exploiting animals and killing animals for food is immoral. Harold is now a vegan activist and the founder of Farm Kind. He is also one of the subjects of the documentary Peaceable Kingdom. Stick around. I want to introduce him to you. Hi, Harold. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Nancy?
I'm doing good. Thank you for being on the Vegan Pulse. I surely appreciate it.
Oh,
Very.
it's my pleasure. I'm honored to be here.
And are you in upstate New York?
Yes, upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region.
Okay. I'm originally from New York, Brooklyn, New York, born and raised. So there's a little kingship there, New York.
Yeah, yeah.
So, Harold, you have quite an experience and a journey and a tale to tell, but I would like you to start by sharing with us your journey into veganism.
Okay, well, it all started. I was born on a cattle farm in southern Michigan, yeah, a long time ago. And I was um, raised as any farm kid would be. Um, I was indoctrinated into the lifestyle. And I want to be clear, though, that I don't use the word indoctrinated as a pejorative. We are all indoctrinated by our parents and our community into, a set of values, a set of beliefs, and a lot of them were good, but also things that were not so good and were also normalized. Um, so I took that path where I was, we were raising cattle. I was in 4-H and all the typical things that you know farm kids do, and then I just did that for well about half my life, 30 some years, so that kind of dates me right there. And we there were certain things that happened to me as a kid that kind of gave me a perspective about my relationship to animals, but how they showed up in the world too. A The one thing in particular that happened when I was young was my grandfather. I was fourth or fifth generation on the farm, but my grandfather, he um, had bought a Holstein steer. Well, we raised beef cattle, and this is a dairy cow. So we've got this dairy steer there, and he was pretty big. And they do get much bigger than beef cattle. They get a lot taller. And we named him Max. And I'd get home from school, and first thing you did, I'd jump off the bus, run down, do chores, feed the cattle, water them, whatever. And Max was always the one cow that would come up to us and wanted to be scratched and spend time with us. Well, that's people say, well, why is that so different? Well, we have selectively bred cattle for different purposes, and dairy cattle need to be handled by humans to be milked. So their temperament tends to be such as that they're not spooked by humans, really. They can be herded much easily. They can be handled easily, especially if they've been handled and petted and cared for as calves on up. And beef cattle, you really don't care about that. You just need to drive them. They go out, do their thing on pasture, and then you drive them into a trailer and take them to slaughter. And that's it. So they're different individuals by breeding. So Max was cool. He was the one we could pet. One day he came home from school and he wasn't there. And my I asked my grandfather, I said, where is he? And he said, well, we had to send him off to be slaughtered. And, it broke my heart. Usually we slaughtered the cattle we ate. We did on the farm. But he knew that my brother and I had made a connection and he wanted to spare us that. So he had him sent away to a local meat packer. And a week later, my dad went over, picked up this wrapped meat, and it comes in this white paper packaging. And I don't exactly remember how I reacted to my parents when they brought the baskets in, but I do know that what they did is they took a wax pencil and they wrote Max on all the packages. And then they put them at the one end of the freezer because we always had this huge freezer in the basement that had meat in it. And they put Max at one end. And I refused to eat him. And they figured that was what would happen. And so if I wanted a steak or hamburger or something, I got it from the other end. And a lot of people say, well, why didn't you figure it out then? I was like 8 years old, 9 years old, and, it just didn't, you compartmentalize these things because that part of that indoctrination wasn't just my family, but it was also my church and 4-H, but also the community I grew up in, the neighboring farmers. And my great uncles owned the farms around us. One had a dairy farm, one had sheep. And so I had experience with those animals too, but also just this kind of ethos that they gave to me too. And but the interesting thing that I think the things that reinforced that worldview, um, among them, the thing that probably reinforced me that I was doing the right thing was television. Believe it or not, it was the commercials on television, because at any given time, a commercial break, there was at least one commercial that's selling animal products. And while it's, national chain fast food places, still, it's hamburgers, it's bacon, it's whatever. And, I'm growing up during the Green Revolution. And one of the mantras of the Green Revolution is feeding a hungry world. So I figured I'm doing good work, as a kid. That's how I rationalized it. And, there were other things too. I mean, growing up in a farm in a rural area, I also hunted. And while I shot squirrels and rabbits, things like that, I went deer hunting from the time I was 14 and, on. And I never shot a deer because I'd be sitting out in a blind and those deer were just so beautiful. I was just in awe of them. And as much as I would try to make myself pick up my shotgun, I couldn't do it. And they would come up because you sit really, really still in a blind. And they would come up and stick their nose in the blind and sniff me and stuff. And I would just stay really still and look at them. They'd walk away and I go, just how beautiful is that? And I take a lot of heat from my dad and my brother because their blinds were where they could see me. And they say, I would just tell them I fell asleep. That was because my dad would fall asleep sometimes in his blind. So that was my default. I fell asleep, but I just couldn't shoot him. And then later on, when I was early 30s, came to a time when my grandmother was going to sell the farm, and I opted out. And I just knew there were a lot of family dynamics involved with this. And I left and I moved to Cleveland. I knew some people in Cleveland, Ohio. So I moved there, and that's where I first ran into the word vegetarian. Never heard that word. 4 years of college, never heard the word. Um, and not, not long after that, a year or two, I heard the word vegan, mystified by that. And but I just started reading everything I could, because right from the get-go, um, well, I worked as a mechanic there, and the garage I worked at, one of the very first customers I worked with was this wonderful young Black woman, and the garage I worked at, the mechanic, after they worked on the car, it was kind of unique. It was an independent shop, and after you're done, we were expected to take the work order out and explain what we did and ask if there were any questions we could explain. And she had a bumper sticker on the back window of her car, and says, "I don't eat my friends." And they had little pictures of animals. And I said, "So what does that mean?" I honestly could not put that together. And she says, "Well, I don't eat my friends." And I said, "So you're not a cannibal?" And she goes, "No." She says, "I don't eat animals." I said, "Oh, really?" And I said, "So what's that?" She said, "I'm a vegetarian." I said, "Well, what's that?" "Well, I don't eat animals. I don't eat honey. I don't wear leather." And I'm going, "Oh," I said, "that, I know what that is. My grandmother, who was born in 1900, she called people that were vegetarians, the word their generation used is they were called Pythagoreans." And I go, "You're a Pythagorean." Well, she didn't know what that meant. And I said, "Well, Pythagoras was really a vegan. Most of the ancient Greeks who ran their academies required veganism to be part of the academy." And so I said, "Well, where do you buy your food?" Because I thought it was some kind of mystical thing. And she says, "Well, I go to the food co-op." There was this little co-op not far from where we lived. And I went down there and checked it out and go, "Oh, it supports local food systems. I'm all about that because I'm not a fan of the Green Revolution. So I'm all in." So we signed up, and my wife and I signed up. And then on our way out, there was a little, this is before internet. So there were little tear off tags on a little poster for a vegetarian group. So I tore one off, called the phone number, and went, and that was the beginning. And that's when I started reading and stuff. And the person who probably health wise had the biggest impact on me was this group had one big event as a fundraiser a year. And it was always the same speaker, which was Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, because it's Cleveland. And we live not too far from the Cleveland Clinic. But that was, went to hear him, and I'm like fascinated. And to kind of backtrack, when I was 18, I had a heart attack, but I was home alone. And I didn't know what happened to me, but it was all typical symptoms: my left arm, my left jaw. I blacked out, woke up, I couldn't breathe. I'm laying on the floor, and I didn't know I'd had a heart attack. I didn't know what this was, but being 18 years old, you're bulletproof anyway. So I get up, I'm doing fine. And I never told my folks, I didn't tell anybody. I just figured it was some weird thing that happened. It wasn't until my dad had his first heart attack years later that I knew what a heart attack symptom was. It scared the crap out of me. So when I ran into Esselstyn, I'm just going, okay, I'm paying attention, because heart disease was rampant in my family, and I wanted to do what I could. So long story short, I reversed my heart disease, and I'm doing really well now. And um, but I do want to make a distinction. In those years, um, I was on a plant-based diet. I always tell people I was on a plant-based diet. And because head wasn't connected to the heart yet. Okay, yeah, I understood this idea of animal rights theory, but it was so foreign to me. I couldn't make that connection. I was sympathetic to it and I could understand the arguments, but I hadn't made the connection myself. So I tell people now at that point, I was on a plant-based diet, but now that is being changed. So when you say plant-based in a marketing world right now, it just means it's majority plants. It could have some animal products in it, but we'll still market it as plant-based. So I can't use that term anymore. But plant-based as per at that time, what T. Colin Campbell, how he used it. That's where I picked it up from, was Campbell's work. So I was plant-based. It wasn't until a few years later that I adopted a steer at a sanctuary here in New York. And I think it was the second year after the adoption, I went to an event and I just had this interaction. And that's when it happened. That's when I understood. That steer, his name was Snickers. He was the one who woke me up. And if anybody wants a little more insight into that story, it's in a documentary called um, Peaceable Kingdom, The Journey Home, which is made by Tribe of Heart. And anybody can watch it for free on Vimeo, or they can watch it for free on Tribe of Heart's website. They have a viewing room there with all their documentaries. So,
Right, because
and that,
you were
hmm?
part of that documentary.
Yes, yes, yes. And that was when the documentary was first released. Um, that was what led me into this whole world of activism. I was hired by a sanctuary to be kind of a spokesperson. And later I went out on my own and started doing this work. And there was a lot of it was spending time going to land grant colleges around the United States and talking about basically the nuts and bolts of animal agribusiness, but bringing the ethical and moral arguments to it. And that's, well, everybody is, there's so much of the activist world is focused on welfare, which I really, it even bugs me that people call them welfarists because I had adopted a rescue pit bull who passed away recently, but I was a welfarist because I adopted him. And welfare, the definition of welfare is to act in the best interest of that individual. Well, animal welfare, as it's practiced in agribusiness and in land grant schools, because their textbooks, you can major in animal welfare in any land grant school. And but when I see the activist world adopting this utilitarian idea of welfare and calling it welfare, it's not in the best interest of those animals. It's this utilitarian idea that, you know, the interest of the many outweighs the interest of the few. That's why most activism focuses on factory farming or CAFOs, and which I've noticed. Well, I've worked when I'm living here near Ithaca, New York. I worked for 11 years at the co-op there, and I was a produce buyer for them and worked with local farmers around here. And I noticed just talking with customers in there that I'd always, part of it's a big part of my activism. It's not about hitting the biggest audience as you possibly can. It's about being a mentor to the person standing in front of you. So I would engage people and, we'd have great conversations and stuff, but they always had this out that, well, there's these welfare standards and blah, blah, blah and stuff. And, It was like I was living in Portlandia. It was crazy, it was just crazy the rationale people came up with. And, and while I would argue, what's the difference between the interest of that animal on a grass-fed operation that only has 50 cattle near Ithaca compared to a CAFO or feedlot operation like Howard Lyman ran, who, there isn't. The individual is the individual. It's not about numbers or scale. It's about the rights of that individual, because if you, it's like this, I believe that the idea that some lives matter less is the root of what's wrong in the world.
And that applies to everything, human and non-human.
Exactly. And where did it start? It started with the domestication of animals and plants. That's where speciesism started, because speciesism can apply to animals, but can apply to plants too. And now we've created these cultivars that we call food that can't survive on their own in the wild any more than a pig. If, like a Yorkshire pig, if you let it try to live on its own here in New York, they would die in the wintertime. They just don't carry the body fat, and they're not, pigs just aren't native to northern climates anyway. But yeah, it's a really skewed system, and we do what we can, but that's really part of what my activism has kind of evolved into. And I've always believed that, the activist world needs to stop looking for leaders and heroes. If you're looking for one, go home and look in the mirror, because the person that's going to change the world, your reality is right here, right now, and it's the person in front of you, and it's learning how to communicate, being a student of human nature, learning how to live in the moment. And for me, I have a good friend who just passed away who taught animal law at Cornell. And she always asks me, she says, I have such a short fuse with people who just don't get it. And I said, how do you have the patience to, talk to people, to engage them and have these long conversations? And I said, I look at them and I just say, and I think we all can, but for me in particular, I just say, there for, there for the grace of God, I was. How can I judge anybody? I can't judge, somebody who's still eating animals and say you're a bad person. But yet, I see activists that call farmers and farm workers evil human beings. I get that, but they have to understand that these harms, these injustices, what happens on, you know, on the farm, that's the overt harm. But above that is a, um, I guess what you'd call a managerial harm. And these are people who may or may not be directly engaged with the animals, but they're the ones who say this is the work that needs to be done and it has to be done on this schedule and so on. And then above that, you have what I call institutional harms. And those are the people at the top end of this vertically integrated system of food production, and which is driven by the market and market forces. So it's really a top-down thing that makes that happen at the bottom end. And I don't believe anybody is beyond redemption.
Yeah, I think that before we leave, I just want to mention one thing. As you were telling your story when you were younger, you were, conditioned by your family, society, and where you were. And that's what happens to all of us, wherever we are, number one. Number two is, however, as a child, you didn't want to eat Max. So there was already a spark in you that knew that that was not right. Um, And so I want to say thank you from going to the other side of the fence, as we spoke before, and becoming a vegan activist, which shows that it doesn't matter where you start off, you can get to veganism. Because once you do as you did, educate yourself and find out more, that you see what the right choices are for you. And you see that animals are individuals and should be allowed to live their lives.
Right.
So I want to thank you for your time. And until next time, Harold, bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on another Vegan Pulse. I am your host, Nancy Arenas. Remember, check out our website, like us on Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you have a pulse, you have a purpose. Live vegan.